2:11 a.m. A hospital room almost frozen in silence. Only the faint mechanical pulse of a heart monitor cutting through the stillness, according to some sources. Ngozi Ezeonu was said to have reached the final stage of a devastating illness at the age of 61, and then a moment no one in that room was ever truly prepared for began to unfold. Her son, Chidera Ezeonu, reportedly standing just inches from the bed, saying nothing, not because there was nothing to say, but because every word felt too late, too small. His eyes fixed on her face as if waiting for a sign, a breath, a movement, something that could undo what was quietly happening. The white hospital lights reflecting off trembling hands. Her fingers described as growing weaker, looser, like they were slowly letting go of something invisible. And in those first seconds, time didn't move forward. It, fractured, cutting between flashes, the cold metallic rail of the bed, the slow blinking green line, the silence between each beep stretching longer than it should, and the look on Chidera's face, a look many later described as something deeper than grief, something closer to disbelief. As if the reality in front of him had betrayed everything he thought he still had time for. Hours earlier, according to reports, the room had been filled with quiet conversations, careful whispers from family members, doctors speaking in measured tones, words like stable and monitoring used gently, cautiously, as if protecting the fragile hope still hanging in the air. But hope, as it turned out, was already slipping through their fingers, unnoticed. Earlier that night, it is said that Ngozi had opened her eyes briefly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the presence around her, and some believe, though no one can confirm, that her gaze lingered on her son, just for a second longer, as if trying to memorize something she knew she would not see again. That moment, small, almost invisible, would later become something much heavier in memory, replayed, questioned, held on to like a final message that was never spoken out loud. As the minutes passed, the rhythm in the room began to change, slower, heavier. The machines still doing their job, but with a growing tension behind every sound. A nurse stepping in, checking numbers, adjusting something, leaving again without meeting anyone's eyes. And Chidera, still there, unmoving, his hands closed but not quite touching, as if afraid that contact would make everything real. According to those who later spoke about that night, there was no dramatic moment, no sudden collapse, just a quiet shift, so subtle it almost went unnoticed, until it wasn't, until the silence between the beeps became too long, until someone finally looked up and realized the sound they had been listening to was no longer there. And in that space, something broke, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. Chidera is said to have leaned closer then, not in panic, but slowly, carefully, like someone approaching a memory rather than a person. His expression unchanged, but his eyes, no longer searching, no longer waiting, just fixed, empty, in a way that only comes when something irreversible has already happened. Outside the room, life continued, corridors still lit, distant footsteps echoing, a phone ringing somewhere far away, but inside, everything had already stopped. Later, according to some accounts, there were questions, quiet ones, about timing, about signs missed, about whether the truth had been softened too much in the hours before, whether hope had been allowed to stay longer than it should have, and beneath all of it, a feeling that something had been taken, not just a life, but the chance to be ready for its absence. As the night moved toward morning, the hospital lights didn't change. The machines were turned off, one by one. The room returning to a kind of silence that felt different now, heavier, final, and Chidera, still standing there for a moment longer than anyone expected, as if stepping away would mean accepting a reality he wasn't ready to face. And somewhere beyond that room, the world was already beginning a new day, unaware, unchanged, while inside, a chair remained beside the bed, slightly pulled back, as though someone had just stood up and hadn't decided whether to come back or not. 0:30 to 4 o'clock. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced slowly, in fragments. According to several unconfirmed sources, the first signs were said to have appeared long before that silent hospital night. Not dramatic, not alarming, just small interruptions in an otherwise controlled life. Moments that, at the time, didn't seem connected. A pause between takes, a hand briefly pressing against her side, a smile that stayed just a second too long, as if covering something deeper from the perspective of the film crew. Many later recalled the same detail. She kept going. She always kept going. Even when we suggested a break, she would wave it off, laugh it away, and return to the scene like nothing was wrong. And that was the pattern. Consistency. Professionalism. A performance not just on camera, but off it, according to some accounts. There were days when shooting had to stop unexpectedly, not because of visible illness, but because of something harder to explain. A sudden fatigue, a quiet withdrawal, moments where she would sit alone, staring at nothing in particular, before returning as if nothing had happened, and no one questioned it. Not seriously? Not yet? From the audience's perspective, everything remained unchanged. Appearances were maintained, interviews were given, public events attended, and fans continued to see the same familiar presence, the same strength, the same voice. She looked fine, she sounded fine, nothing seemed different, many would later say, and that is what made it harder. The absence of obvious signs, the illusion that time was still on their side. But behind that illusion, according to reports, small details were beginning to accumulate. A prescription bottle kept out of sight, tucked deep into a bag, taken only when no one was watching. A phone call that came late at night, unanswered, then quickly deleted from the call log. A hospital visit, brief, quiet, never mentioned again, and perhaps most telling, a shift so subtle that only a few noticed. Her laughter, still present, but softer, shorter, as if it no longer reached the same place it used to. Some believe, though nothing has been confirmed, that there was a moment, a specific day, when she knew, when the truth was no longer avoidable, but instead of sharing it, instead of stopping, she continued, as if holding the reality at a distance for just a little longer, as if time itself could be negotiated, delayed, reshaped. And from Chidera's perspective, the timeline feels different, closer, more personal. There are said to have been signs he couldn't fully understand at the time, conversations that ended too quickly, answers that felt incomplete, a hesitation before simple reassurances. "I'm fine," repeated, but never quite convincing. And maybe, according to those close to the family, there were moments when he almost asked more, almost pushed further, but didn't. Because trust, because fear, because sometimes the truth is something both sides are silently agreeing not to confront. And so the days continued, blending into each other, the symptoms, still there, still growing, but never fully acknowledged, not publicly, not completely, until they could no longer be contained, until the interruptions became too frequent, too visible, until the strength that had been maintained for so long began to slip, not all at once, but in pieces. And even then, according to some sources, there was still an effort to hold on to normalcy, to routine, to the version of life that existed before the first sign ever appeared. As if letting go of that version would mean accepting something irreversible, and somewhere in between those moments, unnoticed by most, a quiet reality was forming, one that would only become visible when it was already too late to change its course, 4 o'clock to 8 o'clock. The timeline didn't begin with a single moment. It unraveled quietly, almost politely, according to multiple unverified sources. A few months before that night, Ngozi Ezeonu began to appear less frequently, not suddenly, just a gradual absence. One event missed, then another. Explanations given, scheduling conflicts, personal time, phrases that sounded normal enough to avoid suspicion, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Then she disappeared entirely. No appearances, no interviews, no public acknowledgement, just silence. And in that silence, questions started forming. 1 month later, whispers about her health began to circulate, quietly at first, then louder, spreading through conversations that never quite reached confirmation. Have you heard something? Is it serious? Or just rumors? But no one answered. Or maybe no one could. Because according to some accounts, even those closest to the situation were holding on to fragments. Not the full picture. 2 weeks before that hospital night, it is said she had already been admitted, but the information was kept tightly controlled, almost sealed. No statements, no announcements, just a quiet transfer from public life into a private space where time began to move differently. Inside those hospital walls, days didn't pass the same way. They stretched, blurred, became measured not by hours, but by small changes. A number on a screen, a breath taken with effort, a conversation that ended too soon, and outside, life continued, unaware. Fans still waiting for updates that never came, still expecting a return that was already becoming less likely. According to those familiar with the timeline, each day inside that room carried its own weight. Family calls becoming shorter, voices more careful, pauses longer than the words themselves, sentences that started but never finished, as if everyone could feel there was something they didn't have time to say, but couldn't find the courage to say it anyway. And then the countdown began, not officially, not declared, but felt deeply. 7 days before that moment, there was still movement, still small signs that things could stabilize, or at least hold. Conversations about improvement, cautious, fragile, but present. 3 days later, the tone shifted, noticeably. According to some sources, the room grew quieter, not because there was nothing happening, but because everything happening felt too heavy to speak about. Machines doing more work, fewer visitors allowed, and Chidera moving between hope and something much darker, something he couldn't name yet. 3 days, then 2, then 1, and with each passing day, the space between expectation and reality narrowed until it became impossible to separate them. And then, the final hours, described by some as the most difficult to comprehend, not because of what happened, but because of how little seemed to change on the surface. The same room, the same light, the same quiet, but underneath, everything was shifting, rapidly, irreversibly. Time no longer stretching, but collapsing. Minutes feeling shorter, breaths more fragile. Every sound in the room carrying a kind of finality that no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. And somewhere within those hours, according to those who later tried to piece it together, there was a moment, small, almost invisible, when the outcome was no longer uncertain. When the timeline, that had been slowly building for months, finally reached the point it had been moving toward all along, and yet, even then, no one said it, no one confirmed it, because saying it would make it real, and reality, in that room, was something everyone was still trying to delay, even as it was already happening. 8 o'clock to 12 o'clock. And then, the focus shifts, not to the machines, not to the doctors, but to one person who never left the room. According to several unconfirmed sources, Chidera Ezeonu was there longer than anyone else, arriving early, staying late, sometimes not leaving at all, as if stepping outside even for a moment might mean missing something irreversible. And yet, despite being so close, there was nothing he could actually do. No action that could change the direction things were already taking, and that, more than anything, is where the pain begins to deepen. Small details start to emerge, the kind that don't seem important at first, but become impossible to forget later. A phone held loosely in his hand, screen lighting up, then dimming again. Messages arriving, unanswered, calls coming through, ignored. Not because they didn't matter, but because none of them felt as urgent as the moment happening right in front of him. According to some accounts, he would look at the screen, not to read, but almost as if searching for something else. A distraction, an answer, a delay, something to interrupt what he was witnessing. But nothing ever did. And so, the phone remained there, present, but useless. Just like everything else in that room, there are also descriptions, quiet ones, about how he held his mother's hand, not tightly, not desperately, but carefully, gently, as if he believed that too much pressure might break something already fragile. Like the connection itself was delicate, temporary, and could disappear if held the wrong way. That hesitation, that restraint, is something people later struggled to understand, until they realized it wasn't hesitation, it was fear. Fear of making the moment real. Fear that acknowledging the fragility would somehow accelerate it. And so he stayed in that space, between holding on and letting go, without ever fully choosing either, emotionally. According to those who observed him, there was no visible collapse, no dramatic reaction, just a stillness, a kind of quiet intensity that felt heavier than any outburst could have been. His face described as calm, but only on the surface. Because underneath, there was something else. Something breaking in slow motion. Something that didn't show itself all at once, but revealed itself in fragments. A longer pause before speaking. A gaze that didn't shift when someone entered the room. A breath taken slightly deeper than necessary, as if trying to hold everything inside. And then there is the feeling many believe defined those final days for him. Not just pain, not just sadness, but something more complicated. A sense of being betrayed, not by a person, but by time itself. Because everything about the situation felt wrong. Either it was happening too fast, decisions needing to be made before they could be understood, or it was happening too slow, every minute stretching into something unbearable, forcing him to stay present in a reality he wasn't ready to accept. According to some sources, there were moments when he seemed like he wanted to say something, to ask a question, to break the silence, but didn't. Because what if the answer confirmed what he was trying not to believe? What if speaking it out loud made it final? And so the words stayed unspoken, building quietly, adding weight to a silence that was already difficult to carry. And in between those moments, time continued to move, indifferent, steady, unaffected by the intensity inside that room, and Chidera remained there, caught between memory and reality, between what had been and what was slowly disappearing, unable to stop it, unable to fully face it, just watching, waiting, holding on in the only way he could, even if that way felt like it wasn't enough. 1200 to 1600. And then, there is the part no one can fully reconstruct, not because it didn't happen, but because so much of it was never said out loud. According to several people close to the family, there were conversations that simply never took place. Moments where words could have been spoken, but weren't. Questions that stayed unasked, not out of indifference, but out of defo, out of fear. Because sometimes asking the question means being forced to accept the answer, and not everyone is ready for that. From the perspective of those inside the family, the atmosphere is often described the same way. Everything felt too quiet, not peaceful, not calm, but restrained, as if everyone in the room was holding back something, waiting for someone else to say it first, and no one ever did. According to some accounts, there were long stretches of time where the only sounds were mechanical. Distant footsteps in the hallway, the low hum of hospital equipment, and the occasional voice, lowered, controlled, never rising, never breaking, because once it breaks, everything breaks with it. And from the outside, the questions sound different, sharper, more direct. Why didn't anyone know earlier? How did it get this far without being seen? Was something hidden? But those questions, according to some sources, don't have simple answers. Because what looks like silence from the outside often feels like protection from the inside, protection of dignity, of hope, of the fragile space where reality hasn't fully settled yet. And yet, that same silence becomes something else over time, something heavier, something harder to carry, because it leaves behind gaps, spaces where something should have existed, a conversation, a confession, a goodbye, but didn't. And those spaces don't disappear. They stay, according to those who have tried to describe it. They grow louder after everything is over, filling the mind with versions of what could have been said, what should have been asked, what might have changed if someone had spoken just a little earlier. And then there are the details, small, almost insignificant on their own. But together, they create something deeply unsettling. A hospital door, closed more often than open, not locked, but rarely crossed without hesitation. A light that stayed on, even when no one was speaking, casting shadows that moved slightly with every shift in the room. And behind that door, according to those who were not inside, there was always the same uncertainty. What exactly is happening in there right now? Is anything changing? Is it better? Is it worse? No one could say for sure. And that uncertainty, that lack of clear understanding, becomes its own kind of tension, because the unknown often feels heavier than the truth itself. And for those inside, including Chidera Ezeonu, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of things left unsaid, full of moments that passed too quickly to be understood, and yet too slowly to be escaped. And that is where the sense of loss begins to shift. It is no longer only about what is happening, or what will happen, but about everything that didn't get the chance to happen at all. The conversations that never reached their ending, the reassurances that were never fully believed, the final words that were never spoken. And as time moves forward, those absences don't fade. They remain, suspended, like a sentence that was never finished, like a door that was closed, but never completely understood from the other side. 1600 to 1900. And then, everything returns to that exact moment. 2:11 a.m. The same room, the same light, the same silence that now feels heavier than before. According to some unconfirmed sources, the rhythm inside the room began to change. Not suddenly, not violently, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. The sound of the monitor, once steady, now slower, more spaced out, each beat separated by a pause that seemed just slightly longer than the last, and no one spoke. Not because they didn't notice, but because noticing meant accepting. And acceptance was the one thing no one in that room was ready for. Eyes began to shift, not toward each other, but toward the same point, the screen, the hand, the rise and fall that no longer looked the same, and still, no words, only waiting. According to those who later tried to describe it, the tension didn't rise the way people expect. It didn't build into panic. It sank. It pulled everything downward, like the room itself was slowly losing weight, losing sound, losing time, until there was almost nothing left to hold on to. And then it happened, not as an event, but as an absence, a silence that lasted just a second too long, then another. And in that space, something irreversible quietly took place. No alarms, no dramatic movement, just the sudden realization that the sound everyone had been listening to had stopped returning, and Chidera Ezeonu, according to some accounts, didn't react the way people might expect. There was no immediate breakdown, no visible collapse. He remained standing, exactly where he had been, his gaze fixed, unblinking, as if he was trying to hold on to the last moment before it slipped away completely, as if by not moving, not reacting, he could delay what had already happened, his hand still near hers, but not tightening, not pulling closer. Just there, suspended, caught between instinct and disbelief. And in that stillness, there is something more unsettling than any cry could ever be, because it suggests a mind trying to process something it refuses to fully accept. Seconds passed, or maybe longer. No one could tell anymore, because time, in that moment, no longer moved in a way anyone could measure. And then, according to some, a shift so subtle it almost went unnoticed. His eyes, no longer searching, no longer waiting for change, but settling slowly into something else, something heavier, something final, and even then, he didn't cry, not immediately, because sometimes the first reaction to loss is not emotion, but emptiness. A kind of silence inside the body that mirrors the silence in the room. And that silence stretched, filling every corner, replacing every sound that used to exist there, until even the presence of others felt distant, irrelevant, like everything outside that single moment had already moved on. And he hadn't. Not yet. And in that space, the climax doesn't explode. It disappears. It dissolves into something quieter, something deeper, something that lingers long after the moment itself has passed. Because what happened in that room was not just an ending. It was the point where everything that came before it suddenly had nowhere left to go. 1900 to 2000. And outside, nothing stops. The city remains lit, streets still moving, headlights passing through intersections, people walking, talking, unaware, or maybe aware, but unable to feel the weight of what happened in that one quiet room. Somewhere, old films of Ngozi Ezeonu are still playing, scenes where she laughs, speaks, moves with certainty. Moments captured in time that do not change, that do not fade, no matter what happens beyond the screen. And her name, still being mentioned, still echoing in conversations, in memories, in places that continue as if nothing has been interrupted. But in another room, not far away, everything feels different. A chair remains slightly pulled back, as though someone stood up, but never returned. A glass of water, untouched, left exactly where it was placed. The surface still reflecting a light that no longer feels warm. A phone lying nearby, silent now. No vibrations, no incoming calls, no reason for it to ring anymore. And in that same space, according to some accounts, Chidera Ezeonu remains there longer than expected, not because he has something left to do, but because leaving would mean stepping into a world that has already moved forward without her. And he is not ready for that yet. So he stays, sitting, or maybe just standing. No one is entirely sure. Looking into a space, that no one else can see. Not focused on anything specific. Just somewhere between memory and absence. As if replaying something that cannot be paused, cannot be changed. His expression quiet, almost unchanged, but carrying something deeper. Something that doesn't show itself all at once, and time continues, slowly, quietly. The light in the room not flickering, not dimming, just remaining, unchanged, while everything else has already shifted. And somewhere in that stillness, there is a feeling, not loud, not overwhelming, but persistent, like a question that never receives an answer, because what is being waited for is something even he understands, will never return. And yet, he waits anyway, without moving, without speaking, as if the silence itself is the only thing still connecting him to what used to be there.